time for us to check back in with People and Their Quilts and see what John Rice Irwin teaches us about now, see what else he finds out about quilting. If you've missed any of the previous readings, though, just look in the description below for a playlist. Eva Rogers Clausen, a quilter for 78 years. Eva and Garfield Clausen live on the same farm where they started housekeeping over 3/4 of a century ago. The home is located in the Speedwell, Tennessee community near historic Cumberland Gap, and the old log house where they first lived is still standing next to the white frame house where they now live. It cost them $100 when they built it 67 years ago. Eva is 92 and Garfield is 97. On a recent visit, we found Eva busily working on her latest quilt top and Garfield sitting on the porch chewing tobacco and enjoying the beauty of the lush spring countryside. Here's a photo of Eva and Garfield Clausen sitting on their front porch with one of the last of many hundreds of quilts she has made during her 93 years. This one now belongs to a neighbor, Mimi Joyce Leach, and was borrowed for the photograph since Eva has given away or sold all the quilts she has made. They were a most friendly and affable couple and responded eagerly and often simultaneously to my questions. Eva, tell me a little bit about your quilting and your life here in this community. I've made quilts all through life. I've made all different kinds and done all kinds of fancy work like embroidery, crocheting, and I've spun. I learned to spin on the big wheel. I've done all kinds of work. I said it's history to the young people to know how we used to have to live. Before our children got big enough to work, I went to the fields and pulled corn. We didn't have no fertilizer then, and he'd, Garfield, haul the manure out and pile it up, and I'd carry it in my old cotton apron out to the hill and drop it by the side of every hill of corn. I've cut corn, I've cut tobacco, I've grated tobacco, I've suckered tobacco, and I've raked hay, and I've done everything but plow. But after the children got big enough to work, I quit that. I had so many children, 7 is a big bunch, it took something to put up enough food for them. I'd can 400 and 500 cans a year. I had a big garden, and what it didn't take for the family, I'd sell it. Garfield hauled produce all the time. I'd raise chickens, and I'd raise turkeys. I'd raise 1,000 chickens a year. In World War II, I raised chickens, and I got 65 cents a pound for 'em. I'd raise 500, and when they was gone, I'd raise 500 more. Almost every old quilter that I've interviewed, I've talked with some that were over 100 years old, enjoyed gardening. Do you like to garden? Yes. Why, I had an acre garden last year myself, and I filled my deep freeze just as long as I could put a thing in it. Canned my beans and my tomatoes and made my tomato juice. Why, yes, I love to garden. Where were you born? I was born just about a half a mile up the road here. I was a Rogers. I'm the oldest of 11, 6 boys and 5 girls. I've just got one brother a living. He's 78 years old. Our folks was lawyers on my side of the house, lawyers and doctors. Well, tell me about when you first remember seeing quilting done and how old you were when you started quilting. I was 17 years old when I got married, and I was quilting long before then. Mother learned us to do everything. I could cook when we was married, and I could do embroidery work. I could do everything before I was married. Did your mother do a lot of quilting? Oh yes, she had to. She never did make quilts to sell. She quit after she got enough made for her family. She just gave us children 4 quilts apiece. That's all she give us. You mentioned the turkeys that you raised, and Garfield was telling about driving them to market. How do you go about driving a large flock of turkeys all the way to Tazewell? Just bunch 'em up, about 1,000 of 'em together, and put them in bunches. Get you a row of men and drive 'em, you know. You get too many together and they clog up. Take about 1,000 and divide 'em up into about 4 or 5 bunches. You couldn't drive 'em now, too many cars. They wasn't no cars back then when you drove turkeys, and we flew 'em across the river. How did you make them fly across the river? If one flew, they'd all fly. If you crowd them along the bank and get one to fly across, then here they all go, flying across. Did you have to keep them on the road? Yeah, keep 'em on the main road, and when night would come, they'd go up and roost. Oh, they'd fly up. You couldn't drive 'em. We had about 1,200 turkeys here one night and had to have 12 men and boys to help drive 'em. Garfield would go around the country and buy turkeys from other farmers, and he'd keep them here in the barn until he had enough for a drive. Let's get back to quilting. What did you use for filling in your quilts? I raised cotton right out there, you know, and I learnt to card my bats, you see, to pad my quilts. I had a box that I knew just exactly how much it took to pad a quilt. Law, you talk about good quilting, that was good. We had an old cotton gin, and you'd lay your cotton down in front of the fire and get it good and warm, and you'd run it through that cotton gin. It had a wheel on it. We gave our oldest son the one we had. How many quilts have you made over the years? Well, I guess 2,000. I don't know for sure. Surely I've made that many in 93 years. Did you give a lot of them away? Oh, yes. I give the children all 12 apiece. They's 7 of them. Then I've got 21 grandchildren, and I give them all a quilt apiece. And all the granddaughters, I've made them all wedding quilts. And then I've made all the great-grandchildren quilts. I've been making quilts all these years. How long have you been selling quilts? Well, you know what I've done? Mr. Moss, who was a senator of Kentucky, well, they had a cabin that my brother built. He built them a house over here at Straight Branch Dock. They, the senator and his wife, come over and stayed for the summer, and we got acquainted with them. Awful nice people. And so I was a-quilting. I'd start in August quilting when I was able to quilt, and she come over and wanted to know if I'd sell some quilts. Oh, I had so many of them stacked up. I said yes, that I'd sell them, but I had never sold no quilts, you know. You know, Mr. Moss said to her, now you buy every one you want. Well, we went upstairs, and she picked her out 5, and do you know what? I let her have them quilts. What? $20 a piece, $20, and they just kept going up, you know. I sold them for $40 for a good while, and then I sold them for $50. And now when I furnished everything, I've been a-getting $150 for 'em, and that's not enough. How long would it take you to make one? Well, it would take 12 to 14 days. That's how long it took to quilt a quilt. So now you make a quilt like I'm making now, and it takes a month. Do you enjoy quilting? Law, yes, I reckon I do. Which do you like to do best, quilt or garden? Well, I've always worked out all my life, even before I was married. Why, you know, I'd druther be out in the summertime working in the dirt. The winter was the time you did most of your quilting, I guess. Yes, but in the afternoons, the way I do now is to go out early of a morning and work till maybe 9 o'clock, and then I'll come in. I'll do my housework and quilt during the day. Then I'll go out late in the afternoon and work till 9 o'clock in the cool of the day, you know. That's the way I make the garden. Well, you've been quilting a long time. You said, I believe, that you made your first quilt in that old log house when you were 17, soon after you were married? Yes, that's where we started. You know, we was married up the road here a little ways, and we come here and moved in with his parents, and the next morning we got up at 4 o'clock. Well, Gar got up to go plow corn, and I had to get up too. And it was a strange place, you know. Well, it wasn't long till I was helping to cook. I could make better bread than his mother could, better biscuits. I always have been a good hand to make biscuits, and it wasn't long till I took over the garden. Now, she didn't work. She was just 45 years old, his mother was, when we was married, but she didn't work out like I've always worked, but Grandpa, Garfield's father, would help me. Mother give me a sow and pigs, and we raised them pigs and sold them for $15 and bought the first bedstead we ever had, and I picked the geese for feathers to make a feather bed. Have you ever had a honeymoon? No, nothing. Never had a trip nowhere. Of course, I've been to Michigan. I had a sister that lived up there, and I've been up there twice. That's the only place I've ever been. And this 75th anniversary celebration that you had on May 10th, was that the first thing of that type you've ever had? First thing we've ever had. Oh, law, I did enjoy that. I just met so many of my friends that I hadn't seen in so long, you know. Girls, well, they was younger than me, but they were good friends. I hadn't seen them in 10 or 15 years, I don't guess. Whose idea was it to have the anniversary celebration? Mine, she chuckles. Course, I couldn't have had it if it hadn't have been for my children. You know, they just have everything. I've give everything I've had to my children, and they just had everything pretty, and it was the nicest thing you ever saw. Poor Walt, that's my son-in-law, just carried all them pretty flowers. They have an awful nice home. She just has everything. Silver, candelabras, silver trays, and everything. And it was beautiful. The table was. Pretty tablecloths. Have you been sick much in your life? Have you been in the hospital much? Never till the last 4 or 5 years. I broke my hip, and that was my first time in the hospital. Were you in the hospital when your children were born? No, had midwives with the 3 first ones. They was all born at home. We had midwives with 3 girls, and you know back then you sat on the husband's lap to have your babies. I've never heard that before. That's the way it was. My first 3 children was born on my husband's lap. We had a midwife, Aunt Betty Hahn. We set up housekeeping in this old house over 75 years ago, and we're still at it, Garfield laughingly states. My grandpa raised his family here, and I don't know how much older it is than that. It must be about 200 years old. Hundreds of quilts in her 93 years have not dampened Eva's enthusiasm for sewing and quilting. She is shown piecing a dogwood quilt top and talking excitedly about how pretty it is going to be when it is finished. Quilter Mary Cross, 100 years old and going strong. Although Mary Shootman Cross is well into her 101st year, she is as alert, talkative, and exuberant as a teenager. She was born in Overton County, Tennessee, but has lived most of her life in nearby Albany, Kentucky. She now alternately lives with her children and was staying with her daughter, Fanny Honeycutt, in Knox County, Tennessee, when I talked with her. Her hearing was good and her mind as keen as a briar. I commenced piecing quilts when I was 8 years old, says 100-year-old Mary Cross. She is shown on the front porch of her daughter's house, playing shortening bread on the harmonica and holding one of the last tack quilts she made. I was raised in a little log house. My daddy was a renter, tenant farmer, and we just moved from one farm to another. Had a big family, 8 children, and he was sickly. He took sick while he was a soldier in the Civil War, and he never was well. The last real day's work he ever done was the day I was born. We had it pretty rough. The first glass lamp that ever come in Birdtown, I got one of 'em. Well, I went to town and saw them lamps, and I went back and I begged my daddy, and he give me money, 50 cents. I went back and got the glass lamp. Well, I thought I was rich. I thought I was rich with that glass lamp. It burnt coal oil. Before that, all the light we had was an old open grease lamp. You'd twist a little rag just as tight as you could twist it, and you'd get you some grease, hog lard, and put it in a saucer, and you'd put that rag in there and let it hang off over here on the edge. Now that's what candles we had. The way we kept fire was to get oak bark and build a little fire up in the fireplace, cover it up, and you could just keep fire on and on. I commenced piecing quilts when I was about 8 years old. Back when I was piecing quilts, when I'd go anywhere, people would give me pieces of their dress to put in my quilt. Why, it would just tickle me to death. Had to save everything. Fanny, get that one and show him, the one that's made out of strings and pieced on paper. A little string that wouldn't be that big, she measures a 1/4 inch. You could piece then on paper and then tear the paper off when you went to set it together. Save every little string. Wouldn't throw away a little string as big as your little finger. You asked me about quilting parties. If we had room enough, we'd put up 3 quilts at a time and really have a big one. I told Fanny the other day that if she'd have a quiltins now, she'd have room for 4. Mary laughs. Yeah, a whole bunch of people would come, and you know Fanny, before she was grown, she'd go to 'em, and she took the brag name of being the nicest quilter, made the little stitches. When I asked Mary if she ever heard of the old custom of throwing a cat on the finished quilt, she laughed heartily and grabbed both my hands with hers to make sure I listened to her account of this practice. Well, now they'd generally be 2 boys come in and 2 girls about the time you was getting ready to take the quilt out of the frame, and they'd catch the cat, and when they took the last thread out of the lacing, why, they'd get at each end of the quilt, and they'd throw the cat in there, and when the cat jumped out, the one closest to where he jumped out would be the one to marry first. They had a lot of fun that-a-way. Why, I've shook the cat myself, she laughs. Did I tell you what I used to make the quilt lining out of? I used to make them out of old tablecloth, the old tablecloths. You can take that old cloth, soak it in homemade soap, and roll it up and let it stay a little while. Then you can take a case knife and scrape every bit of that oil off. And then you can color that lining. Course, it was made out of the best factory they was. And law, that there quilt lining would last for years and years and years. During one of my visits with Mary, I asked her if she knew Henny Copeland, the old granny woman who lived near her childhood home. Mary studied for a while and finally said, "No, I knowed some Copelands, but I didn't know her." Then in a most parenthetical manner, she said, "I was a midwife, a granny woman, you know." I didn't know, but I soon learned that she had delivered babies for over 3/4 of a century. And I never had a speck of bad luck in my life. I was the only one there was in that neighborhood, and it just kept me going all the time, you see. They'd give me $1, but lots of times I wouldn't take it. The people was so poor, and I wouldn't take their $1. A feller offered to pay me once. I saw that him and the children didn't have nothing on the table to eat but fried green tomatoes and cornbread, and I wouldn't take his money. I've delivered a heap of babies and not charged them a penny. I believe in helping people out. I commenced when I was young. I was 20 when I commenced, and I went on up until the last 10 years, I guess. I just quit going. I told 'em I was too old. I'd druther quit when the time was good and I hadn't had no bad luck. I quit 'fore I had bad luck. Martha McMahan, the stand-up quilter. If we were awarding a prize for the most unusual quilter, then Martha Shelton McMahan of Knox County, Tennessee would surely take the blue ribbon. A widow and the mother of 18 children, this tiny 83-pound woman earns her living by making and selling quilts. She makes no pretense about artistic fulfillment or creativity, but candidly states that making quilts is the only way she has to pay her bills. Martha was born near the North Carolina border in Sevier County, Tennessee, and grew up on a farm beside Burgess Creek. One of 8 children, she early learned to work in the fields as well as to perform the various household chores. She learned to quilt as a child by watching her mother make quilts to keep the family warm. Her mother, who is in her 90s, is still living. In 1936, Martha married James Britton McMahan, and they eventually moved to a tiny concrete block house on Newbert Springs Road, a few miles southeast of Knoxville. Her husband worked at odd jobs as a shade tree mechanic and collected and sold metal junk and cardboard. Martha explained that she often helped her husband. We'd pick up cardboard in the dumpsters and behind the stores twixt here and Kingston Pike in Knoxville. We sort of lived that way, not perfect, but we got by. We'd work for several days to get a truckload, and it'd bring from $18 to $22 a load. I asked Martha about her children, how many she had, where they were, etc., and I asked her, of course, about her quilting. Well, I've got 14 children living and 4 dead. I had 'em all at home. I didn't go to no doctors, and I never was in a hospital. I don't believe in hospitals. No, I sure don't. I had a granny woman most of the time, Lou Maples from Sevierville. I had her several times, and my husband's mother, she delivered 1 or 2, and then a woman by the name of Lena Dare, she delivered some of them. My husband died 4 years ago, the 20th of next month, February 1983, and all the children are gone from home. I've got one boy that lives close by, and he comes through during the day and looks after me, fetches my wood and sees that I've got water in, and he takes me back and forth to the store to get my quilting material and such things. I quilted and sold some quilts when I was raising the family, but not too many. I've really been in the quilting business, I'd say, for the past 6 years. Making and selling quilts is the only income I have. I work from early in the morning, sometimes I start before 7 o'clock, and I work till late at night. I work sometimes till the television stations sign off. It's awful quiet and peaceful out here then. This brought us to an amazing discovery concerning Martha's quilting. I noticed there was no quilting frame in the house. Upon inquiry, I learned she used neither a frame nor a hoop. I do all my quilting standing up. I lay the quilt on the bed there, and just stoop over and quilt it. I quilt all day long until late at night a-standing there. I never set down when I'm quilting. Now, of course, I set down when I'm piecing a quilt, but as far as setting down to quilt a quilt, I never do. Never used a frame. Never had one. To get one right and everything, I can piece a quilt and put it together in a week's time if I work from early morning till late at night without stopping, and for the thin-backed ones I get $30, for double-backed one I get $40, and for the thick-backed ones I get $50. The baby quilts, they're always $15 each. By the time I buy my material, I'm not getting a heap for my work, but I like to quilt. It gives me something to do. The crude sign, the modest home, the outdoor privy with a painted door, and the attractive quilts on a sunny January day tell much of the story of quilt maker Martha McMahan. Martha McMahan, whose only income is from the quilts she makes and sells, never had a quilting frame. I always do my quilting standing up. I work 16 hours a day, just stooped over the bed, a-quilting. Fascinating reading today. This may be my very favorite, and I know the reason would be because it tells the stories of the women, the stories that he shared. I love quilts, and I think they're beautiful, and I love those beautiful patterns that we've been seeing, but I'm really a storyteller at heart, and of course all the stories that I really enjoy most, like most people, are the ones from where I'm from. So even though these ladies are not from right here in my immediate area, they're from not too far down the road, I guess you would say. Knoxville's not that far from us in that surrounding area, and even the other areas he talked about. So I just really loved hearing their stories, hearing their insight. So many things jumped out at me. Now, the first ones that he talked to Eva and Garfield, how fascinating. They'd been married so long, and what a blessing that they both had lived, they're both still living at that 75th anniversary mark. Makes Granny and Pap was married 50 years when he died, but of course, he died. Granny's still here. But I wish, of course, that Pap could have lived that long. But that part's amazing in itself. And then that they both seem like they're still out doing stuff. That's really impressive. But I love the house price, that their house cost $100. My, how times have changed. Of course, in those days, that $100 was hard to come by. You know, it wouldn't be like our, you know, not that $100 is not a lot today. It is to people that don't have it, but it's certainly not comparable to being able to buy a house. You know, what a different time. And as I said, of course, in those days, $100 was really hard to come by, but such a drastic difference. Now, Pap and Granny's house, I think Pap borrowed, I can't remember, it was right at $10,000, but I think it was more like $7,000 or $8,000, maybe $8,000, but just say $10,000. So if I'm wrong, $10,000, and that's what it cost to build Granny and Pap's house. Now, Pap did most all the work himself, him and friends and family who pitched in and helped. So drastic difference, of course, from then till now, and even me and Matt, because we had Pap and we had friends and different people, and our house, we borrowed $30,000 to build it, which is, we've been here, be almost 28 years. This will be the 28th year, so even in that time, things have changed. Now, as I said, we had a lot of people that helped us, and, you know, we didn't have to worry about paying for labor or anything. So that, even today, that would help if you were able to build your house yourself, I know. And then another thing that's changed, especially from that $100 and then perhaps $10,000, but even from the $30,000, is that codes and regulations have changed. Now you can't just, in most places, you can't just, like if you've got a neighbor that, you know, knows how to do sheetrock, you can't really just let him do it. You have to get somebody to sign off on everything. In other words, you know about all those codes and regulations, I'm sure. And some places are more lax than others too, so that might play into that. But anyway, I just thought that was fascinating. Then that made me think of Pap's house and then mine and Matt's house. How did you like the driving the turkeys? Now, I've read other accounts of that too, of people driving turkeys, but wouldn't you just like to see that? And of course, even in I guess this was in the 80s when John was writing this book, even then Garfield said, you never do that now, you know, way too many cars, you couldn't do that. But how fascinating. And then to know that, if I didn't know that, like if one turkey flew across, then the rest of them would just follow, so they would just kind of keep forcing them till one flew, and then they would all fly. Really interesting to think about. Of course, you've probably heard stories, and I know I have, and read accounts of not just driving turkeys, but, you know, thinking about pigs and, of course, cattle. So lots of different things. And then I love that Eva, when she's talking about all that work that she did, she was a worker, but that when she woke up, her and Garfield, the day after they were married, woke up there at his family's house, and it was kind of strange. I don't think she meant that they were strange people or bad people. She just meant it was just different. It wasn't where she had always been, you know. It wasn't her family, so it was different. And she had to find out how they did things and kind of go along with them, because they wasn't all going to change just for her. I've always said to people, you know, younger people thinking of giving advice, marital advice, is that that's one thing. When you're first married, you realize that even though you've dated and all that, when you move in together, then you realize how these differences that you didn't even realize. Like, for example, me and Matt, we dated for 4 years before we were married, and you think, well, you pretty much knew everything about No, when we lived together, then we found out, you know, like, well, my family, even something as simple as how you fold the clothes, my family folded the towels this way, well, my family folded them this way. You know, you find all those little small things, so I think that's what she was talking about. But I love that she said, I was always a good hand at making biscuits. That's just so Appalachian to say that. I was always a good hand at making the bread, making biscuits. So his mother, very wisely, I think, instead of like rebelling maybe against, well, that young daughter-in-law thinks she can do everything, she just said, that's your job. Go on and do it. You do it better than I do. So I really loved that. And interesting too, even in those days, so Eva was such a worker and loved to be outside. But then Garfield's mother, she says she was only 45 when they got married. Of course, people had kids early back then. But she says she didn't go outside. She didn't work outside. So that just wasn't her thing. Or maybe she don't really say she was unhealthy, so I'm thinking that just wasn't her thing. So all that was interesting. But the most interesting thing, I'm like John. I'm like, what? Say what about the birthing in your husband's lap? I've never read that or heard that in any of all my research about Appalachia. So I'd be very interested to know if you've ever heard of anything like that. So makes me wonder if maybe in some of John's other books, if he ever come across that again, or if that was the only time. But the way Eva says it is just like, well, sure, that's just what you did, and then talks about the midwife, you know. But that was really strange to me, especially this, and then Mary talking about both of those. Of course, talking about childbirth really made me think, because of course both my girls are expecting, but I've never heard of that. So please share a comment if you have. Tell us what you know. And then the next one I thought was really interesting. All of it was, but Mary Cross, the lady that was sitting on the porch playing the harmonica, sweetening bread, seemed like she was a spitfire and real character. I would have loved to have known her and talked to her. But the most interesting thing I thought she talked about was how she got her quilt lining. That just seems strange, and I'm not sure I've ever seen a real oilcloth. So see, in my mind, I'm picturing tablecloths in my lifetime that just have that kind of it is kind of feel flannelly on the back, but so thin. I don't see how you could ever scrape anything off and have anything left. But again, I'm sure she's talking about something that I've just never ever seen in my lifetime. But I loved how she described that, and how she said they would just last. They were just the best. And how she used those in quilting. Now I'm even second guessing myself. Did she say that was the lining or the backing? Maybe that was the backing, but either way, still fascinating. I liked, though, that she said once she rolled it up and soaked it, that she scraped it with what? A case knife. I still say case knife. In fact, I think yesterday I said, somebody hand me a case knife. Now when I say that, a lot of people think, well, you're talking about like a pocket knife, a fold-up case knife. Matt has several of those. That's one of his favorite brands of pocket knives, is case knife. But no, I'm talking about the knife that comes with your silverware. Like a lot of people call it a butter knife, a bread knife. That's what we call a case knife. So I really love that. And of course now Mary may have been talking about an actual pocket knife, but I bet she was talking about a case knife, like what I call a case knife. And then the very last one that we read about, Martha McMahon, really interesting lady. I thought it was really, of course, fascinating that she had 18 kids. That's, wow, totally fascinating, 18 children. But interesting that her and her husband, sounds like they just kind of done this and that to make money. And she says it wasn't perfect, but we got by. I like that. You've probably known people, I know people like that they just kind of trade and sell and do different things. But like for your whole time you've known them, like their whole life, they never really had like we would say, a public job. They never really did that, but somehow they just made it. And it didn't seem like they were always struggling either. It's just kind of, in my mind, I'm thinking like a wheeler and a dealer. Like they just, maybe sell stuff at the flea market, and then they do this and they do that, and somehow it just all adds up enough to make a living. So I thought that was really interesting that she, the way that she talked about her and her husband, of course the 18 kids. And then I thought it was interesting, just like he did, that she stood up to quilt. Now I'm not a quilter, so I have no knowledge of any of the techniques and all that. But I can kind of see myself, like I am a make-do person. Like I just make do. Lots of times I try to do stuff and I don't have what I need, and I just try to make do with what I've got, and most of the time it works. So I can kind of see her thinking like, well, I'm poor, or maybe not even, she might not have thought of herself as poor. Maybe just I don't have that and I can't afford to go get it, the quilting frames, or maybe she didn't have in her little house, there was just nowhere to put them. And she just thought, well, I'll just lay it out on the bed and stand over and quilt. And maybe for her, that just worked better. I don't know. That's interesting. But like John was saying, and all the people that he spoke to that quilted, that was the one person that stood up to do all her quilting. And as she said, not while she was actually making the quilt blocks or the design of the quilt, she sat when she was doing her piecing. It's when she quilted all those layers together that she stood up. So that was really interesting. And then I guess the other interesting thing about Martha was that she loved to quilt. She said that. And she said, I don't really get enough money for my, what I'm doing, but I love to quilt, so I just do it. But it wasn't like an artistic thing. I mean, it was, I think kind of it was. I guess she's a good example of all the way through. I keep going back to one of those first ones we read where he talked about the creativity and the necessity. So I guess Martha is a prime example of that. because it was necessary for her to quilt and sell those quilts to pay her bills and to make it. But then she says she loved to quilt, so there had to be a creativity in there. She had to be. And you can see in those two photos beautiful, beautiful work that she did. So I guess she's a good example of that, even though he did remark that she, more than anyone else she talked to, that he talked to, just said, I do it because I got to make money. That's why I do it. So interesting to think about it. I hope that you enjoyed hearing this part of the book. I hope you enjoyed my thoughts, and I hope you'll share your thoughts. And of course, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday so we can see what John talks about next. I think this is the part where there is going to be a series of more interviews, so it'd be really interesting to see who he talks to next.